Welcome to Purposeful Lab, a production of Franciscan University. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Keebler, and joining me today is, for the second time on the show, is our provost here at Franciscan, Dr. Steve Hildebrand. So, Steve, good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise, Dan. Thank you.
So this season on the show, we've been looking at the relationship between the theory of evolution and the Catholic theology. Particularly, it's the 75th anniversary of the papal encyclical Humani Generis, which was the first encyclical that discussed evolution. The encyclical discussed other things besides that, but it was the first sort of mention of biological evolution. And we've had people on the earlier episodes talk about Humani Generis in detail and what it says about scriptural interpretation and what it says about polygenism and monogenism. And then we've had people talk about intelligent design and Aquinas' 5 ways and things like that. So we've covered a lot of bases. And now here on the sort of final show, just sort of look at a global level, the relationship between modern science and particularly modern science's approach to evolution and sort of Catholic theology. If people are watching, they can see in the background there a copy of my recent book where I went into this in detail to see how do we make the science of evolution sort of resonate or compatible with what we know of the truths of the faith. So, I know you've looked at the book a little bit. And,
I've read it, yeah, with great delight. Yeah, I'm grateful to be here and eager to get into this stuff with you. To me, really valuable. I would say from the outset that being here at the university, I think for me, I was in theology, so, it's kind of easy for a theologian to be here. But really wonderful, I think, for people like you and in other disciplines, that you get to explore freely things that you may not otherwise. And to me, your book is the fruit of this. It's the culmination of a lot of work, a lot of study, a lot of thought. Some of that, I would dare say, wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been here. The particular mix of colleagues, our particular commitment to the teaching of the church. So I'm just so grateful that God brought you here and has, I think from the beginning, put this issue on your heart and mind. And I would say, from where I sit, this book is the fruit of almost 25 years of thought and reflection and collegial interaction.
Yeah,
I thought it would be great if you would just give a glimpse of that, a more detailed sense of how it came to fruition.
No, you're right. It is a fruit of a lot of work, and it is direct fruit of teaching here at Franciscan in 2 ways. One, interacting with colleagues, both in the sciences and outside the sciences here, and just informal discussions and, over a beer, over lunch, at conferences. And I've had, a lot of, opportunity to sit down with theologians who are experts on biblical exegesis or philosophers who are experts on Aquinas and the way he approaches, understanding of creation, for example. And so that was really helpful. I actually started writing the book 13 years ago. And at that point, my first draft, I realized, I don't know enough. I looked at it like this. I said, I'm not ready to finish this book because there are certain things I just didn't feel comfortable with. And it was more conversations with other colleagues, not only at the university, but outside the university as well. But it's certainly being at Franciscan really facilitated those, because there's this collegiality I found amongst the faculty here and opportunities to interact with people in other disciplines.
Can you give an example of that? Okay, so I read your first book on evolution. You co-authored.
Yeah, that was more just looking at the science of evolution and different ideas about the science.
So when you said you're not ready, obviously you're not talking about the science. I mean, that's one of the things that's so impressive. Like you have the science down, and it's so clearly presented. So if that wasn't it, obviously that wasn't it. Where did you have to grow? Like what did you think was lacking?
Yeah, so I think what I thought was lacking, what I knew was lacking, it wasn't thought, I was dead honest, I didn't realize, is sort of understanding what the church has said about evolution over time, and what does it mean when the church says this in this document, or when John Henry Newman says this, in just a letter, versus what is said in Humani Generis. How bound are we by what is said there, and is this a prudential, a prudential judgment, or for the time, or is this something? So understanding also reading some of the church fathers, which I've up until 15, 20 years ago, I read Augustine in college, as an undergraduate, but reading a lot of the church fathers and what they thought about Genesis, and how they looked at Genesis, and how they looked at science of their day, right? That was huge. And then having colleagues that like Dr. Paul Symington, who I interact with quite a bit, where I talk to him about what does Aquinas say about this, and then colleagues that have like yourself, who know the patristic scholars, right, and ask you, well, what did Augustine mean by this, and so I think it's almost as if I got a sort of an undergraduate degree in philosophy and theology, during that time. I'm doing this reading on my own. I don't claim to be an expert on those, but I do know now enough to know where I could get into trouble, and I should stop talking, and know where I'm confident that this is sort of what the church has said, and what the fathers have said, and from the day I showed up here, I felt that the colleagues were open to having discussions about these issues. And the other aspect is my students, right? So if I was teaching at a secular university, I might get one or two students that might come to my office hours and might say, hey, I'm Christian, I am picking up on you're Christian or Catholic, I can sort of see. And they might ask me a few questions about, well, how would you fit this together? It's not the way it is here at all. As soon as I start talking about evolution, hands go up and be like, well, how about this? How about that? And so there's all these questions that I had to deal with when I started teaching, particularly to non-majors, non-bio majors, when I would do a survey course and we talk about evolution. Questions come up about, are Adam and Eve historical people? How do we understand the fall? How is there death before, the fall, if evolution is correct? There's all these questions that the students, great questions that the students have, and these are questions adults have when I go out and talk about these topics. And so, I would give very pat answers at the beginning, or just punt. I said, I think they talk about this in Theology 101. I give them your number. His office is over there in Egan. He's really happy to talk to you about it. Yeah, so you do that. But as I matured and read more, and I felt more confident of saying, okay, sometimes I wouldn't be able to give an answer, but I said, well, here's the parameters. This is what the church sort of allows for, and this is what we have to hold to. We don't really know about this, but this might be one way, this might be another way. So I could at least give them a framework to think about these things. And so, and it's those students and those questions and the conversations I had with faculty, both here and elsewhere, that led to, after many, many years, feeling, okay, now I feel confident of writing the book. And the goal of the book is, it's not to convince someone that evolution is correct, or common descent is correct. Well, I believe that the evidence is overwhelming for that humans are related by common descent to other organisms. But the goal of the book was a little bit more modest, was for students who were concerned about these issues to realize there's nothing to be afraid of. So the truths that we learn through science can be integrated through the truths that we know theologically by revelation and through the tradition. And that was what I wanted. So that if they felt, okay, I'm not forced to make a decision here. I can just study the issue and come to my own conclusion. I think that frees them up to actually investigate in a very a way that's going to make them more likely to reach the truth of the matter, right? And that's what I wanted to do, and to help students who were struggling, thinking they had to make a choice of either or. No, you don't. And this is a way you might think about it. And it's not as if you have to force a square peg into a round hole. I actually think that there's a lot of synergy there, that I think that evolution makes sense in light of the incarnation and in light of salvation history, and that the two sort of play off each other. It's a very profound, deep truths that come from seeing both of them in dialogue with each other. Yeah.
Dan, you're hitting on what I think is one of the really fantastic achievements of the book. Is nowadays our knowledge is so fragmented, like super specialized. You go through graduate school. I remember my dissertation director. We would go to these dissertation defenses. I wrote in and studied in early church, but you would go to other people's defenses.
Yeah.
So we would go to these dissertation defenses for the scripture guys, and they might write on a word, or they might write 300 pages on this word in, John 1:2, or they're writing on, a dissertation on Luke chapter 13, verse 1a.
Yeah.
They're like 300 pages on this, right? So my director would always walk out of these defenses, and he would shake his head, and he would say, their book is too small. Like, this is so specialized.
Yeah. And it's the same in every, in the sciences as well.
Right. Yeah. I can't remember what you wrote your dissertation.
I don't even remember.
But yeah, you're just so, the real, it's really wonderful. Like, you go so deep in a particular field of human knowledge. It's just fantastic. It's so rich and there's so much there. But the cost is that you don't have a sense of the unity of knowledge or the unity of truth.
Yeah.
So to me, one of the great accomplishments of your book, which is the fruit of all these years of study and conversation, dialogue, and so on, and taking student questions seriously, is that you've achieved a real, I don't think you're just conversant, but you really have a handle on how these things fit together, these different truths. The metaphysical side's important, the theological side, different weights of different magisterial documents, all kinds of things like that. You really weave that together. And it's a great example for us. We're always wanting to, I say of our formation here, I've come to describe it as the beginning of wisdom, a very modest beginning, right? When you think of how much there is to know. But wisdom is about seeing the whole. Really, it's about seeing things as God sees them. And so God sees everything, of course, with as much depth as there is. He created it. But then, of course, he has the holistic vision. So our whole effort in the formation of our students, and really in the formation of faculty, is to try to take on God's vision. Like, how does he see this?
Yeah.
How does he see how science and the truths of faith integrate, or science and metaphysics, philosophical metaphysics?
Yeah.
And it takes a long time. Your whole trajectory in education, you're getting more and more specialized.
Right.
And then you realize in school, you're not taught to do what we're trying to do here.
No, and it's also that you're actively discouraged from doing that often, and often by colleagues, not colleagues necessarily here, but the colleagues are like, so I teach a course for bio majors on evolution, right? And so, you're encouraged, just stick to the science. You just talk about, when you're teaching the science course, you're just going to talk about, okay, here's the fossils, this is the age of this is, the genetic, but particularly when it comes to humans, like in the fossil record and how they relate, as soon as you start talking about that, it raises a whole bunch of metaphysical and theological questions that you're taught just to put aside. Okay, Benedict has a great quote that I love about this, and he says, he's talking about what's the meaning of evolution, right? What's the meaning and purpose of evolution? And he says, to the theory itself, to the scientific theory, that's a methodologically foreign question. Like, the science alone can't answer that question, right? But he says to a real live human person, that's the whole point. That's the only question that really matters,
That's
right?
the meaningful question.
And so I see you do one of two, I think a lot of times in modern education we do one of two things. We said, well, look, you just stick to the science and that'll tell you everything. And it doesn't. You've got to interpret the science and you've got to make sense of it from a philosophical view. Everybody brings some type of metaphysical lens to the scientific data, right? Nobody has I think it was philosopher Thomas Nagel, nobody has a view from nowhere. Everybody comes in with a view, whether it's a Christian view, an atheistic view, and so forth. And so you can't necessarily set that aside, right? Or
and you don't want to, right?
You don't want to.
If you try to set aside those commitments, you're not going to arrive at the truth.
Yeah.
So if your whole point is to arrive at truth and meaning and purpose, and if you're as a theist, a Christian theist, if your view is to say, I want to see this as God sees it,
right.
like if a priori you exclude God's perspective from the conversation, you're bound to have. I mean, maybe you arrive at some sliver of a truth. But it's really impoverished.
Yeah, you don't get to see the cohesive whole, right? Yeah. And it really struck me because that's the way I sort of started. Well, I got to just stick to science. I don't want to talk about theological implications, because that's the way you're sort of trained. Just explain the data and so
it's
forth.
frightening. I mean, I would say
I didn't know what
you've accomplished.
I didn't want to open up and get pounded by the students. It's like, you're a heretic, whatever.
Right.
But it dawned on me like. So you read popular literature on evolution, and they say, well, no, evolution shows that there is no God. Evolution shows there's no purpose. I'm like, well, if you're able to do that, why can't I bring in my metaphysical lens and look at evolution? So,
exactly.
First and foremost, you have to be an expert in the data. You have to make sure that you're understanding the data properly and you're getting good and you know the data, right? And you're articulating the science. Which changes over time as we get more knowledge, but you're articulating and know the science as best you can given the current state of affairs. And so I don't want to disregard that because if you want to understand the meaning of something, you have to know what it is, right? And so if you don't know the science, and you don't really know what it is, you're not going to figure out the meaning, right? But the question then became like, how should I look at the data of evolution, right? Mm-hmm. So everybody comes at it, with some type of, like I said, worldview, right? And as a Christian, as a Catholic, like, what is the way we should look at everything? How should we interpret everything, right? And we should interpret everything through Christ and through the lens of salvation history. Mm-hmm. And it seems like if God is the source of everything, right, then all of creation should be enlightened if we look at it through the lens of salvation history. And I think that's when you look at evolution through that lens, it just to me blows me away about how many parallels there are and how much it shows how God sort of works through sort of creaturely causation and things. So a lot of people talk about evolution and we'll say, but look, evolution, there's this chance things that happen. A meteor hits the earth and that evolution now goes this way and it goes that way. So how could God be in charge? And I always say, well, during salvation history, there's King David, and he sends off Uzziah to get killed in battle. So the temple gets destroyed because the Israelites are worshiping false gods. So there's all of these twists and turns, but somehow they can't thwart God's plan. He works through creaturely causation the same way he does in evolution. So you see, like that allows us to see evolution in the proper way. It's not as a threat to God. It's the way God works with and allows creatures to participate in his ultimate plan. Right?
And on a very personal level, I think all of us reconcile. Certainly, any believer, at some level, reconciles chance and providence.
Yeah.
Like you would say, for example, when you met your wife. It's by chance. When I met mine, certain chance things. We happened to register for the same class, happened to apply to the same university, register for some of the same classes where we met, that kind of thing. But yet, it's clear to me, even though I didn't plan it, the Lord did.
Right.
So we all can reconcile. We can get deeper into some of that stuff. One thing I want to return to, though, that you said earlier, you might get the impression that Christians or philosophical theists who approach the world with a worldview, a certain set of commitments. You've said, and I think rightly, that the secular atheists are also approaching with their own set of commitments. But you set that aside. We are approaching with a set of commitments, which oftentimes we've given a lot of rational reflection to those commitments. But what I wanted to focus on, you were saying earlier, is that when you approach with this commitment, you might get the impression that there's like a lack of freedom or free inquiry. And you said the opposite, that approaching, and I think here at Franciscan, maybe they're not telling me, but I have never heard a faculty member complain about a lack of free inquiry. In fact, oftentimes it's the opposite, that our commitments open us to a free inquiry in a different way. And I want you to elaborate on that. Like when you approach these questions, and a lot of times we don't have easy answers. Right. But you don't approach them with a sense of anxiety or there's a sense of freedom, a sense of wonder. That I think you well capture in the book. And look, when you're getting into some of the theories, for example, about how we reconcile, how we deal with monogenism and polygenism and this kind of stuff. Like, it's not, to me anyway, not exactly clear how that all works out. But the whole enterprise is characterized by a freedom from anxiety and a kind of wonder in the truth. Maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
I mean, that's a great sort of example. If you look at, say, the origin of humans, for example, right? So how do humans come to be through an evolutionary process? And one of the things that people are always, as Catholics, try to fit into that. Well, how do we account for original sin, right? So how does that fit with sort of an evolutionary history, right? You could approach it in some way, with some fear. It's like, oh no, evolution is going to show that there's no original sin. Oh no, and everything goes out the window. But I think, approaching the natural world and God's creation from a perspective of be not afraid, right? It's like what it's going to reveal, right, is going to be something that is not going to be contrary to what we learned via the faith. So that gives me full freedom to just look at the data. And so true. Somebody says, "Oh, we found a fossil that's this age." I'm like, "Okay, well, that's interesting. Let's figure this out." Okay, well, what does that mean? All right.
And it might cause you to rework
a little bit
scientific conclusion you had come to, or whatever.
And that might cause me to rework the way I might think about how original sin, comes into the world, right? Because of some change in the scientific data of when we think humans might have emerged or where and so forth. But there is no concern like they're going to find, in the scientific data that original sin isn't real, and so there is this sense of, there's certain things that we know that are rational, reasonable through revelation and through faith, that sort of give you sort of confidence that they're going to enlighten how we understand evolution rather than be something that we've got to guard from what evolutionary data might show us. And so I think it opens up like a freedom of inquiry and to say, well, how about this? What about this scenario? If humans had evolved from this species and then, this happened, okay, well, and then thinking it through with people that understand the philosophy and understand the theology. And that to me is like what the intellectual pursuit is, and bouncing ideas and thinking these things through. And the popes have said, and in papal documents I've read multiple times, where they'll say, well, if there is a supposed or apparent contradiction, because that was an apparent contradiction between science and something we know. Our understanding of Scripture, so either we don't fully understand the Scripture, or we got the science wrong, and sometimes we're not sure. And so it requires patience and not rushing to judgment to throw something out to say, well, we're not going to ever talk about that again, right?
And one thing that's great. I don't think anybody could accuse our ecclesial authorities these days of being harsh and quick to judge. And,
exactly.
And sometimes they have been, like they might be too quick to shut down a particular line of inquiry. Usually there were reasons for that, but even more from the side of our authorities, like there's a certain freedom they've given us and confidence. I imagine the DDF hasn't been knocking on your door.
Yeah,
you know? So, that's good.
And that's the thing in the book, just like with the, talking about original sin, I pose 4 or 5 scenarios, or 3 or 4 different ones.
Yeah.
I'm not, it's not that this is how it happened, and I've got some metaphysical commitment to that. But I think I try to sketch out ways, because students want that, right? They want to, how might, how do we think about this evolutionarily, right? And so give them some scenarios of how this might actually fit together. Here's a couple of ways of thinking about it. And they're like, okay, maybe. And then and it reduces the tension. They go, okay, it's not as obvious of a conflict as I once thought it was, but it's also an open idea. And so now they start thinking about it, and they're like, well, I don't like that idea, but maybe this, and then you have a dialogue in the class, and it's fun when you get a student engaged in that, and they're starting to think things through with, okay, here's the parameters that we can't give up on, right? And so we can't say, well, original sin is just, an artifact, or it's just, the fact that humans were created with, an animal nature that's sinful. Well, no, the original sin is our turning away from God. And it's God didn't create us evil or sinful. God created us good, and we brought that into the world, right? So there's certain parameters there, but within those parameters, there's a lot of space.
I want to say, though, I agree totally. I want to say, though, through the course of history and study and the way the Lord has set things up, so that He's made us. He hasn't told us everything from the outset. Told us a lot of things, but even the way in which He communicates, the parameters, we're growing in our understanding of even how the parameters work. I'll give you an example with original sin. Original sin, some of the really foundational things that we understand about original sin did not really crystallize in the teaching of the church until the time of St. Augustine. Think of somebody like Origen. He died in 254. Obviously, he had a sense of our sinfulness. You can't escape that. You don't need to be told that something's gone terribly wrong here.
That's the most obvious.
Right? But Origen had this idea. He's working it out, and he's of course has the scriptures. He's one of the first people to comment on many of the books of Scripture.
Yeah.
But he has this idea, which is totally wrong, of course, that the sinfulness, the fallenness of our world is explained by the pre-existence of the soul, and really everybody has his own original sin, right? Everyone has his own individual fall from a pre-existent state. And Origen says at the outset of his book on First Principles, where he's talking about some of this stuff, he says, look, if I say anything that's against the faith, go with the faith, not with me. He's very much a man of the church.
Yeah.
And he gives this wonderful list of open questions that the church has not quite worked out yet. And the pre-existence of the soul is on there. You're like, what? Like, it blows your mind. Like, are you kidding? Like, something as foundational as that, Even there's some evidence that Augustine, when he was deep into Platonism, at one point in his intellectual progress, that he was, interested in this question of pre-existence of the soul. Certainly, it's not. We would dismiss that as just kind of obviously wrong. Augustine even didn't do that.
Okay.
But then he comes up with this theory. Once you get rid of the pre-existence of the soul, then that kind of resets the terms of the discussion. You have to think about, okay, let's go back to the Scripture. What are they teaching us about this? What does this mean? And so even your parameter change. I would say with that, the parameter that doesn't change, and I would say would never change, is that God is not responsible for what has gone wrong.
Right.
There's a wonderful line, I can't remember chapter and verse, in the Book of Wisdom. God did not create death. Right? So things have gone catastrophically awry, and it makes no sense to lay that at the feet of God. And so we got to figure that out. Okay, one more example here where you get a kind of reworking of the parameter. It's really largely from Augustine that we get the formulation in church teaching that original sin is transmitted by propagation. And he's like, okay, that makes sense. So for centuries and centuries, that's the teaching. I think if you look it up in the Catechism, they still use that phraseology.
Yeah.
But obviously, there's a refinement in our understanding of original sin and its transmission with the advent of the terrible practice of in vitro fertilization, right? So you have these human beings who are not, they come into this world, they're not conceived by propagation, right? They don't come into being through the sexual union of a man and a woman. They come into being in vitro,
Right.
right? In a petri dish. So then it's like, whoa, okay, are they fallen? Well, you have a bunch of kids you can look at. They are fallen, 100%.
Yeah.
And so it just makes you totally get your point about there being parameters. But in theology, when you study the history of this stuff, you see that even the parameters the Lord makes it so that they need to be refined.
Yeah.
Or maybe you thought a particular scripture verse meant this, or that this was something that you would take literally. And now you realize, whoa, okay, I don't take that literally. And what I love about your approach is that when you discover those things, it doesn't shake your faith. It doesn't undermine your worldview. You kind of have a sense of the awesomeness of the created order, obviously of God, and that there are many things we know, many things that are just unshakable, but there's kind of a progress in our understanding here, you know.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's because it almost broadens the concept of original sin. It's like, okay, we use this language because that makes sense, given what we see in the world around us.
Yeah.
That's
how could you come into existence right.
otherwise, right? Well,
yeah.
no, actually you can. And now there's even more ways you can come into existence, more reproductive technologies rather than just taking the egg and the sperm and fusing. There's other interesting ways of just mixing stem cells together. You can create embryos at like 5 or 6. Yeah. So it's like,
and we're not condoning.
We're not condoning that. Not recommending.
It's not the way to do this.
It's not.
But right when they do it,
home. No,
right?
Yeah.
When they do that, it changes your understanding of reality. Yeah. Interesting.
That's great. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you. So when you're thinking now about, like, on the theological side, one of the non-negotiables, and I think Pius kind of nods to this in Original Sin, when he's teaching against polygenism, when he says, look, it's not conceivable how this can be reconciled with original sin. So it gives you a way to understand, okay, the real kind of rock solid parameter, I think, that he's articulating there is that evil does not come from God, which means we're fallen. And so you can't subscribe to any explanation of reality that undermines those truths. But on the other side, on the scientific side, what are emerging for you as kind of parameters, scientific truths in which we have really a lot of confidence, that are similar to kind of the theological boulders on the other side? That are, you kind of have to, I have my own sense, I'll throw a couple out, but I wanted you to answer that first.
Yeah, I think around human origins, right, there's probably two. And one is that the evidence for common descent. Like, it does seem like either God set the world up so that it would look like we're related by common descent to other primates and other hominid species, which are species that are more similar to us than modern chimps, or that we in fact are. And it's like, so if you look at the genetic evidence and you look at sort of the defects, the genetic defects that we share with chimps, right? And or different pieces of DNA that move around the genome, and they are in the same spot in humans and chimps. And they don't have to be. You could move them a little bit, and they wouldn't have any really functional difference if they were. But they're in the exact same spot, you know. And you see this over and over again. And really, it seems like the only way to explain that is if that happened in a common ancestor and it was passed on. And then looking at, sort of the hominid fossil record and seeing all of these different intermediary forms that you find in roughly the temporal sequence. It's more of a bush. It's not an A goes, those bumper stickers where the A gradually stands up. It's a mess, but overall, it's like, what do you make of these? Because overall, there is a sort of a trajectory that you see in these, and it makes sense with common descent, right? And I just think that so to understand the origin of the first humans, right? It's the Genesis account, the second Genesis account, talks about made from the earth, like the dirt of the earth. We are material beings, right? And I think that's the key, and that material, I say, it seems to have come through an advanced hominid stage, right? That's where that material, and I think that elevates us. Whether God used dirt or an advanced hominid doesn't make too much difference to me, even if the scientific evidence seems to demonstrate that. I think that's one of those. I think that, to me, that's sort of non-negotiable. The question is, in what fashion and how do you go from a hominid to
Am I wrong to be more persuaded by the genetic evidence than the fossil record? I mean, to me, the genetic evidence I find overwhelming. Maybe some of it is I haven't studied the fossil record like you do, but it seems like there's...
The genetic evidence, I think, is more, I think, stronger in terms of like probabilistically. So what's the odds of, all of these pieces and defects being in both places, in the chimps and in humans, and these mobile pieces of DNA being in the same spot and so forth, where they didn't have to be, But I do think, the fossil record is to me, I find it fascinating, and it's because it is, it's so complex. It's so complex, and I think a lot of people, learn about evolution and they think, it's a real simple theory, and it's gradually, and everything sort of changes. It's moving from, an ape-like, it's gradually standing up, and it's like, the world is much messier than that. Science is much messier than that. And we find all different types of hominids all over Africa, particularly in the last 4 million years. But the pattern, is such that if you looked and say, who's the biggest brain hominid 4 million years ago, right? It's going to be smaller than the biggest brain hominid 2 million years ago, right? But you still see some small brain hominids. So it's not like everybody's getting a big brain. It's sort of like we're experimenting on there's evolutionary experimentation to build the hominid form that's going to be best suited to be the type of thing that God is, the form that's going to be rationally ensouled, right?
And there's one thing you can expect from God is complex. Things are more difficult, more complex, harder to figure out than you might have guessed.
Exactly.
Would have been simpler if we had created the fossil record.
Right. I would have made it just really easy to find, and it would be very all in one place.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, the other thing that, and this is one of those things that people say, there's a discontinuity here, is the genetic diversity of modern humans. So it doesn't appear, based on what we know about genetics, that the human population passed through a bottleneck of 2 individuals.
That's the one.
Recently,
okay,
right?
So I would separate that from, like, you have the genetic evidence of the fossil record for common descent.
Yeah.
And that's actually the next one I was going to raise, which again, it just blows your mind to think about this stuff. Is that some of us have Neanderthal DNA.
Yeah. Which
to me is the single most significant piece, and you, again, freely correct me, Dan, I'm a theologian here. It's the single most significant piece of scientific evidence that is relevant to the question of monogenism and polygenism.
Yeah. No, I think, if like you say, hey, modern humans emerge as a single couple, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody's descended just from that single couple, and there was no input from other individuals. That should leave a signature in our genes, right? And so we know, like, there are certain populations that are relatively inbred, and they have lower genetic diversity, and all. There's marks that you can see that in terms of the genetic diversity, the amount of homozygous recessive mutations and diseases people have, and so it appears that we have more genetic diversity than just two, right? And so how do you make sense of that? And there's, I talk about this in the book, there's ways to make sense of that where you have an individual couple that everybody's descended from, but over time there's some genetic information that comes from these non-human, rational humans. And we do know, that all modern humans that left Africa, so all non-native Africans, have alleles from Neanderthals, right, that we share. So the idea, Neanderthals...
that could explain some of the behavior of my children.
Yeah, some people have more than others, so I think your kids might have like 10%, but I only have, half percent.
Right.
I don't know. But you see, so about 50,000 years ago, these are all modern humans that are non-African, are descendant of this wave of humans that left Africa 50,000 years ago, and they displaced all the humans that were out throughout the globe at that point in time. But when they left Africa, they encountered Neanderthals that were in the Levant, the Middle East, and the Caucasus, and so they must have interbred with them. We have good evidence of that, multiple pieces of evidence for that. And they picked up some genetic material. Most of it probably wasn't beneficial, but some of it might have been good for surviving in colder temperatures or toxins and so forth. And so we all, have retained some of that. But you can see how the genetic information came from this sort of mild form of bestiality. But in a fallen world, it's like it's not surprising. That might have happened.
Is this right? The like when you think about the future? Obviously, there are issues that we've not plumbed to their depths. There's questions that haven't been totally resolved. Is this where you think is the set of, like in the future, the next set of questions to work out is around historically what happened? Like you have this genetic picture, but that doesn't tell you historically what happened.
Yeah.
Is that where you think it is, or are there other things that you think are going to be like? What are you going to spend? What's your next book? What are you thinking about next? I mean, you've been thinking about this stuff for more than 20 years, 25 years.
Yeah.
So in your own intellectual path, like what's next for you? What are you thinking about? What are you interested in? What questions do you have that you think need attention? Need to be resolved?
I think scientifically, what I think, and then I'll get to some theological things. Scientifically, I think one of the things that I think is going to help, enlighten us in the next 10 to 15 years is our ability to sequence sort of ancient genomes. So up until, a few years ago, our ability to sequence DNA from, fossils that were really that old was difficult, right? And so now, particularly as we sequence more sort of modern humans that we find in the fossil, there's a human that's 20,000 years old, you sequence their DNA, and then others you can start to map migration patterns of humans. And one of the interesting things I find this fascinating is that when we think of human populations, that human population's there in Eastern Europe. Okay, well, most likely they displaced somebody else to be there, and then the people they displaced had already displaced somebody else. The humans are migratory. They are homo wander aus or something like that. We just love to wander, and it seems like whatever humans are living in the place at a certain time, they displace somebody else that was there before. And I think that's going to help us maybe as we trace back further to see. Narrow down where modern humans may have emerged from, where in Africa, for example, right? So, and I think it's fascinating how we get more and more data, and it makes the picture a little bit even more complicated. Yeah. But I think
it's only going to get more complicated. I think that's a safe bet.
But we're going to see that there's movement of peoples everywhere, and picking up DNA from this group, and picking up DNA from this group, and
now, why does that not undermine? And maybe this will be the second, you mentioned some theological things, but why does that not undermine your confidence in the teaching of the church and in the church's presentation of the truth about man?
Yeah. So what is it that makes humans, theologically human, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not something that you're going to uncover in the fossil record. It's not something you're going to uncover in the DNA, right? So there is certain things about the human form. It's the type of thing that's fitting to be rationally ensouled, right? So I'm not saying anything can be rationally ensouled, but there's something about our physical nature that is fitting to be rationally ensouled. But what makes us human, right, is this free gift of being rationally ensouled, right? And that's what makes us human. And that was a gift given to the first humans and every human after. Right, and it's not something that is explained scientifically, right? So I can understand
because it's not material.
It's not material. I can understand everything there is to know about a sperm and an egg and what happens when they fuse together. But there's nothing in there that's going to tell me a priori, well, that's the thing that should be rationally ensouled, right? If I had no idea whether this thing, because it's a free gift to that thing that God has willed from all eternity, and so wherever we see, from the DNA and so forth, these migratory patterns, at a certain point, there is this, evolution produces the type of thing that's fitting to have a rational soul.
God produces through evolution.
Right. God produces through evolution, right? Yeah. So the evolutionary process brings about what God has deemed from all eternity to happen, the creature that can know and love him, but that is brought apart by evolution and creation, because evolution can't do it on its own. Is evolution as a scientific theory, right? It can only describe material changes, and those material changes are not enough. They don't add up. You don't add enough material changes and you get to humans, right? There's something else, and there's good philosophical reasons for thinking that there's something more than material to the human person, right? And even for atheistic philosophers sometimes say, well, there's something more than just matter here.
Yeah, it's not one way to put that. I think it's not a difference of degree.
Right. Yes.
You're not adding these, slight physiological enhancements or something, and then all of a sudden you have a rational animal.
Right. Yeah.
And then one thing I would say though too is you don't need the faith to tell you that, right? Like if you just having children does this for you. Experience. I remember one of the things that blew my mind with kids when they grow up and they begin to acquire language. They do things, and you correct me if I'm wrong about this, for sure. Truth is more important than anything. They do things, a 2-year-old human being will do things that a chimp will never do. And one example comes to my mind is the creation of a word. So kids will do this. They make all kinds of grammatical mistakes. So your kid might say, I singed today.
Yeah.
And they've never, I know my kids have never heard singed. We don't talk that way. We ain't be talking that way in my house, Dan. So
I wish I could say the same thing. They got it from me.
So what they're doing is they're abstracting, of course, not even self-consciously. They just do it. They're abstracting a pattern of how to make a past tense verb. Right. And they recognize the pattern from the regular verbs, walked and so on. And then they apply that to an irregular verb. But they've never heard that. It doesn't work that way. So they're inventing it.
Right.
Or I have the way my kids space out, I've got a bunch of boys and then a girl. So she's all alone with all these uncivilized boys, So when she was really little, she invented a couple of words. One was stoon, which means basically it's a synonym for stupid. But again, where did she hear that? She just made it up, right? That kind of creativity, I would guess, you're not going to find in non-rational animals with language and so on. And then another one was Rennie, which means you're mean and you don't listen to your mom. That's Rennie.
That's good.
But anyway, one of the things I think people can take confidence from is if a scientist going beyond the realm of science is trying to tell you there's no real difference between you and a chimp, it's not out of bounds to say, look, have you observed these things from common experience? You have to make sense of that too.
Yeah.
You can't ignore the fact that only human beings have this kind of language. It's different from the way that whales communicate and dogs communicate and so on. Exactly. Only we have opera, and the whole gamut of things that comes with rational activity.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and it's an all or nothing thing. If you think about the things that are unique to humans, and you pick one up, They all come with it. They're all. It's not you can. Oh, we'll just have language, and we won't have art. Or we won't have a theory of mind. No, if you have a theory of mind, I mean that I recognize you have different beliefs and knowledge than I do, right? And that's not that's all comes back to this sort of having the ability to have conceptual thought, to think in immaterial abstractions, right? All of that comes together, art, right? But at the same time, you hear people say, well, look, to make certain tools, you need abstraction, right? But to make other tools, you don't, right? So to think about to abstract a tool that has like 6 parts and come up with the idea, I'm going to put these 6 things together to make a tool. You need to think offline and abstract thought about what the thing is. But to take a stick and maybe sharpen it, or take a rock and sharpen it. It's all in the moment. This is how they say, well, look, there's tool use there in animals, and so there's tool use, and it's just sort of degrees, or there's art there.
So you think that's
animals.
wrong? You don't.
I think that's wrong because there's certain like tools, or we say language, right? There's certain language that doesn't involve conceptual communication, right? Yeah. And so they and I don't fault them, but I think they don't recognize the underlying thing that's unique to humans. It's not tools. We're not saying tool use is unique to humans. We're not saying language, just in generic language, is unique to. We're saying conceptual language, conceptual rational thought. That's something that's unique to humans, and I think that's you don't see that in animals. But they can do a lot of really cool things. Animals are freaking awesome what they can do, and they can solve a lot of problems. They're intelligent. They can do things, but they can't think of concepts and put a word that.
And you can recognize. Yeah. Some animals are smarter than others. Yeah. Like dogs are smarter than goats. We have these goats, right? And you open the door. There's a little goat door for them to go in a barn. You open the door, and if one of them's kind of caught in the wrong place, it'll stand like on the wrong side of the door and just stand there looking at it, like they can't figure out. Oh, I got to go around. He opened the door. The door opens this way, not that way. Yeah. So I mean, different animals have, among non-conceptual animal intelligence, you have a range.
Yeah, no, you do, and they have different.
But then my point was, and I think you're saying the same thing, that it's not a difference of degree to go from the, so to speak, the most intelligent animal to a human being. There's a leap there that is not explicable.
Right, and I think it gets lost because we use the same word to describe intelligence language. In animals and intelligence in humans. Knowledge. So we just think, it's just a gradation of intelligence.
Yeah. And we are animals too, so we have in common some of those
intelligent abilities to be able to locate things and remember spatial navigation things, right? That you don't necessarily need.
Or your sense perception can work the same way. One of the fascinating facts that you mentioned is the different ways in which the camera eye it evolved not once but many times,
multiple times. Yeah. So and that looks at the underlying order there that's in the evolutionary process. There's an order there that drives evolution towards certain solutions, right? And it's not just a sort of a random sort of free for all there. And I think that reflects the order of God and the order that you find in the created universe, right? And that's a different way of looking at evolution. Because a lot of people think, it's just chance and randomness. And sure there is. And as you mentioned before, that doesn't remove God from the picture, chance and randomness. But more importantly, there's a deep, profound order there that's essential for evolution to get off the ground and to do anything.
So I don't know how long. No, some of these podcasts go for like 3 hours. So I don't know what you have.
We're about to round up here. So,
okay, before we do, I want to get one, I think, really important set of truths on the table and have you talk about it. Yeah. So one of the things I teach in some of the lower level theology classes is which comports precisely with where we just left the conversation with our rational character, which is the seat of our dignity and so on. But I'll say to the students, look, you have to understand God. And this would be true whether you had evolution or not. Like, let's say the way Augustine thought of our descent from Adam and Eve. What I'm saying is true of that ancient understanding of those things and true of our contemporary understanding of those things. And the point is this, that for rational animals, it's appropriate that God leave the created world incomplete, because with rational animals, it's appropriate that they exercise their reason and so come to flourish by their own activity. So if God had created us, he created us. He didn't even do angels this way, right? Angels are rational creatures, and so they come to perfection, to the beatific vision, through the exercise of their own reason and will. It's different from us. In angelology, it's a single choice.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But my point is, he doesn't create us in heaven.
Right.
And some people lament that, like, man, wouldn't it be better if he just created us and we're in the beatific vision?
Yeah.
Resurrected, glorified body. There's no fall. There's no choice. Like, everything is perfect. And of course, the answer is no. That wouldn't be great, because if God had done that, he would deprive us of the opportunity to reason, to choose, to love, to grow, and to flourish by our own activity.
Yeah.
So with rational creatures, you have a correlate, I think, if God's going to create rational animals, the correlate truth to that is he makes really the whole world incomplete.
Right.
Because it gives room for us, all that you're doing, that everyone has done, all of these centuries, is the participation of human beings in the creative activity of God, bringing the world and ourselves with his help, never, of course, independently of him, and with the fall, with his grace, bringing that to fruition. To me, is a profoundly Catholic take on the world.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And that's people often get hung up on, we were created perfect and then we fell. And say, well, no. Perfection is being one with God in the beatific vision. We were brought in good, right?
Yeah.
But we're creation, in the Catechism it says this, that the creation is on a journey towards something, right? Yeah. And humans are on a journey towards something. Mm-hmm. When we turn away from God, we make that journey much more difficult, right? But it would have been a simpler journey. But we were there to work. It was to till the garden, to use your intellect to bring order.
So to give a very concrete example, the fact that we had to domesticate the tomato, the potato, the horse, the dog, all of that stuff. That's not necessarily a feature of the fallen world. There were going to be things that the first human beings, had they not fallen, there was stuff for them to do.
Yep, right. Yeah.
Right? And to work on this world, to bring it to perfection, to bring themselves to perfection. Work is not a product of the fall.
Right.
Toil is. Right. Yeah.
Futile work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So to me, that fits with the vision that science is uncovering, or the truths that science are uncovering about human origins. It kind of all fits together with this broader picture.
Yeah. No, the scientific work, the scientific enterprise is. I remember listening to Bishop Barron talking about when Adam names all the animals. That's Adam as a scientist. To understand and know and reveal what creation is, right? And that reveals more about God too. So, and that's the thing I think that I want people to take home if they read this book, to see no, evolution reveals God. It doesn't compete with God. We're not trying to make God fit into an evolutionary process. No, it reveals the grandeur of God and reveals the grandeur of the way he respects and works with creatures, right? Yeah. Not as a dictatorial God, not as a puppet master, but as a loving God who draws us to him.
So I think of Pascal's line, we have the dignity of causality.
Yeah.
So he made us to be causes. Now, obviously, we're in a constant and utter dependence upon him, the first cause. But our causality is real. And that's, again, part of this idea that things are incomplete and we help to bring them to completion, which gives the world, sometimes I'll describe it as a kind of autonomy. Like you come to expect secondary causes.
Yeah, right.
That's how you expect things to work. When you get a miracle, it's like the reason it's a miracle is because those secondary causes are somehow not there, and you get a direct intervention of God in this world.
Yeah.
But you kind of expect
That's it.
the secondary causes. You know, it's like when you go to the doctor, you expect there's something in this world causing you your symptoms.
Yeah.
And if the doctor, sometimes he doesn't know what it is, but if he were to say to you, look, Dan, I think, are you right with God? Like, maybe you're having this pain.
That's why your back
Right.
is hurting.
He doesn't appeal to the miraculous. Now, sometimes doctors do. You can think of the doctors that investigate causes for canonization and stuff like that.
Sure.
But their first assumption is, like, there's something in the world that's causing this. And I think that comes from this larger vision, Catholic vision. We don't exclude, of course, the direct intervention of God.
Yeah.
In fact, count on it all the time. We think of the sacraments. That happens all the time. Every time you go to Mass, you get to witness a miracle. Right. So those things are there, but then there's also this understanding that God works through secondary causes, and it's dignifying to us. It can be frustrating because sometimes you would rather, like, just tell me the answer. Right? Can you do this?
In my class, can you just tell me what?
Right. Do this. Like, there's a pain to figuring it out. But I think ultimately, as human beings, we want that dignity of causality. You want what you do to be meaningful. It matters. You don't want it not to matter.
Yeah.
It'd be so tempting if the Lord would say, okay, I'm going to raise your kids for you and make them come out right no matter what. Right? That'd be great. So in a way, but ultimately it would divest our lives of meaning and purpose and really empty so much of what we're about as human beings, empty it of significance. And so he lets it be significant.
Yeah. No, it's great. And that's, I think, a good lens to look at evolution through. Exactly. You know, the way he works with us is the way he works with creation in general. So,
right. Yeah. And he saves us in the way in which he created it. You wouldn't be surprised to learn that there's a kind of progress and development in the life of the church and our understanding of doctrine, all of those things. So, Dan, I just want to end by saying thank you. Thank you for your book. Thank you for 20 plus years of service here. And it's so gratifying to me as your friend and, you know, in my position here at the university to see the fruit that's come of these so many years. I'm just deeply grateful.
Well, thank you for your sitting down. I could talk for hours with you about these things, and thank you for your leadership here at Franciscan and making it the place that it is. And so I definitely will have you back on at some point in the future. So thanks, Steve.
Thank you.